Hello, and welcome to Protect Customer Privacy while Enriching Data Analytics. My name is Ryan Peterson. I'm the Global Technology Segment Lead for Data at Amazon Web Services. I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Today I'm joined by Dr. Anhad Singh, the Enterprise Architect for Data Guys, as well as Tyrone Mills, the Chief Information Security Officer at Trove. Today we're going to discuss how to reduce risk by masking personally identifiable information before it enters your data repositories. We're going to talk about how to effectively inspect all kinds of data, including structured and unstructured data for sensitive information. And we'll talk about simplifying solutions to protect you against GDPR audits of personal data. I'll go first and talk a little about AWS and our plans around data governance. Next, Data Guys will talk about what they do with AWS. And finally, Trove will talk about how they've implemented these capabilities within their environment. So our customers tell us that AWS has 5 really unique benefits and the main reasons that they choose us. From an agility perspective, customers can stand up very quickly and efficiently any of the capabilities that are required for their environment. Elasticity means that they can scale and grow that environment in automated ways, so they don't really have to think about that infrastructure anymore. No more having to buy servers and stand them up and try to make it work, and long lead times before they can scale. Globalization, because we have facilities throughout the globe that are all qualified for those particular countries and regions, it allows you to scale that infrastructure into whatever environment you may need to scale your business into. Reduction in cost. Because you no longer are buying that equipment that you may not even need after you use it for some period of time, or maybe you're having to buy too little and not have enough to keep up with the customer's demand. And finally, functionality. With thousands of new capabilities added to the environment every year, we look to be the best in class as far as new features and functions that you may need. But we're here today because we want to talk about some problems, some challenges we're seeing in the world. Just in the last couple of minutes of talking, we would have seen over 10,000 records stolen from environments in some way, whether that was a malicious outsider or malicious insider. This idea of data breach is becoming a problem, and usually it's because of some sort of hacking attempt, but oftentimes it's because somebody on the inside either walked out with the data by accident. So you see that 18% accidental loss. Or really what I worry about is that 9% malicious insiders. It's one thing to have outside protection, perimeter protection. It's all another thing to try to protect against the people that you in theory need to trust. We reached out to customers and we talked about this privacy issue as being a question. We started asking, what do you know about your data? And it was amazing how many different C-level executives couldn't answer many of these kinds of questions. They started asking me, well, I don't know what type of data I have, or where I store it. Do I have the right legal agreements in place? Do I collect information from customers under the pretense of a certain legal agreement and then breach it by accident because maybe my reporting teams are running BI on something in a way that they're not supposed to? And how do I ensure that that process all in between is taken care of and that my consumers I have a upstanding trust with? And they weren't the only ones asking these questions. Regulators started asking these questions. They have been for years, where we've seen some additions to this list of growing regulatory agencies and bodies who in some way take care of privacy is the GDPR in the bottom right there and the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. Those two in particular have started adding additional criteria that are really second to none that you can't get away with not dealing with. This list is also ever expanding. I haven't even had a chance to add India, Brazil, Canada, Australia, Singapore, Thailand, who have all in the last few months created new privacy policies for their constituents. So when we start looking at what is the root of all evil, we think about all these different attacks, all these different ways that data can be misused, either on purpose or by accident. And what we found is that at the center of that evil is the collection of PII. Now, PII goes through a process, though. We know it gets collected, and collecting it adds some sort of risk to the environment. Storing it then adds additional risk. Using it adds additional risk. But where we see the most amount of risk is proliferation. When data stops or starts leaving the data repository where it's first collected and starts going into additional locations, including your data lake or your EDW, and starts being used by potentially hundreds or thousands of different downstream personnel, then the risk starts to multiply. And then finally, the deletion of PII at the final stage of using it, whether you should delete it or shouldn't, and when. So as I started to design out an architecture that would work well for AWS customers, I started really thinking about major components. All of the kind of obvious things are in the design, but what maybe is less obvious is that we look at ETL instead of ELT, and that basically means instead of loading data into an environment and then transforming PII out of it, we look at, can we transform it before the data even lands in the environment? And that protects against a certain number of people who might otherwise get access to it, including file services administrators, storage administrators, et cetera, because the transformation is happening before the data even arrives. The second thing is we really started worrying about proliferation, not collection. Realize that in order to do business, you oftentimes have to do things like get someone's address so that you can ship them a package. So we're not going to have to, we can't necessarily stop you from collecting data. What we can do is try to figure out a way to reduce risk of proliferation. We realize that hashing, in our opinion, beats encryption. Encryption over time can be hacked. Almost every encryption technology built 10 years ago has already been compromised in some way. And so we look at hashing as a one-way process that can't be undone as an ideal way to hash that personal information and identity data. And then finally, when you get into data matching, a decentralized model is better than a centralized model, because in a centralized model, all data is going into a single repository and creating a honeypot for hackers. And so, decentralized is really the method we prefer. So this is a high-scale architecture of what we call the de-identified data lake. Not all the components in here are necessary. Each environment may be a little bit different. So what we did is we put all of the solutions in there that you may or may not need for different capabilities. And as an example of that, if you deal with a lot of video and images, you may want to use recognition in order to determine whose information might be in that image. So, for example, you had MRIs where somebody was handwriting the person's name or the person's birth date or something like that on there. How do we get that information extracted so that we know that that image may be something that we need to protect? And so certain environments, pieces in here and elements are important. What I want to talk about today, and we've invited Data Guys to tell us more, is how Data Guys helps in this environment by reducing the risk associated with PII. And so with that in mind, I want to invite Dr. Anand Singh to talk a little bit about what Data Guys does in this environment.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction, Ryan. And thanks for all those great insights into data governance and the Amazon Web Services. So my name's Anand Singh, and what I'm going to do is just talk about a few challenges and how they can be overcome as far as data governance goes. From there, we'll get into just a quick overview of Data Guys, and then how the landscape of privacy has changed over the last few years, and then finally into how Trove has become such a pioneer in combating these challenges. So first of all, the big problem that I want to address here is regarding the governance processes, creating this privacy inventory, right? This is the fundamental thing that you have to do if you have to tackle any kinds of privacy, compliance, security, or a governance problem. Now, the big thing here is that in order to deliver this privacy inventory, you have to scan a lot of different repositories. And typically, organizations, they have big data deployments, they have databases, file shares, and just a bunch of different repositories where this data resides. Now, what that lends itself into is another problem, because you have all these different repositories. The scale of data that these organizations are collecting and storing and analyzing is enormous. And finally, because of a similar problem, you're storing data as structured or unstructured or semi-structured. So really, all these three things come together and they pose a massive technological challenge. So the way you solve these problems is, first of all, whatever solution or technology you use, you have to make sure that it can connect to all these different repositories. So the connectors that the technology uses must be flexible. And also, they have to be remote connectors, because you can't really sit on these repositories and bog down the performance of these systems. Secondly, as far as the scale goes, you have to leverage machine learning techniques, because there's, one thing we say around here is there's always a time to scan 100% of something, but there's never a time to scan 100% of everything. And what that really means is that, or the scanning to get these insights has to be smart, so you can scan some part of your environment and make accurate judgment about what's in the rest of the environment. And lastly, whatever data parsers you use, they should be able to crawl through your structured, unstructured, and semi-structured data. So once you overcome these technological solutions, then obviously the business has a bunch of problems they want to solve. So first of all, compliance, and Ryan talked about a bunch of these laws, especially all these countries that are getting their own privacy mandates now. For dev tests and analytics, again, you want the data to be made available, but you have to make sure that it's in bounds where it can comply to all the regulations that apply to this organization. And then, we say that that's great. If you found your sensitive personal data, you can pseudonymize it or minimize it, but there is always an avenue for an enterprise to have open, exposed data, especially in your production environments. It's all right to have personal data, but the question is, how do you secure that? And finally, and this is something that we're seeing across the board, when businesses, they realize the immense benefits of AWS and they want to migrate into the AWS cloud environment, how do you do that migration securely, and again, within the legal bounds and the compliance laws? So again, to solve these big problems, first of all, a comprehensive privacy inventory is required, because when you do get audited, the first question that an auditor is going to ask you is, how much personal data do you have in your environment? Why are you storing all of that data? Where are you using all of that data? And what are the controls that you built around that data to make sure that it's properly accounted for? The second is for analytics and dev test sort of use cases, and Ryan alluded to this a little bit earlier, is the privacy is best maintained if you can one-way transform this data without having this capability of going back. With this, you're able to keep all the analytical value of the data and make sure it's not exposed. And again, for production data, similarly, you have to encrypt it or hash it in a way that you can go back. And lastly, for cloud migration, before the data moves into the cloud, make sure you scan it, figure out what's sensitive, remediate it, and then move it into AWS, and then rescan it to make sure that no privacy data leaked. So keeping all of that in mind, here at Data Guys, what we're able to do is offer these 5 main features. The first is detection, give you a comprehensive repository of the quantities and location of exactly where all the sensitive data is. The second is protection. Again, depending upon the use case, if it's production or non-production, this could be one-way masking, or it could be a reversible encryption, decryption. Next, monitoring. Everywhere you have sensitive data, we need to see who's accessing what, right? So a great example of this is if there's HR people in your organization, they should not get access to somebody's PCI data, right? So how do you monitor who's accessing what? And over time, create these behavioral profiles. Again, we leverage machine learning. And again, Ryan alluded to this earlier, the insiders, how do you really detect threat against insiders? You have to do some really, really deep user behavior analysis. So the monitoring will help you achieve all of that. And lastly, the right of access and right to erasure. This is, again, more GDPR inspired, where we can actually pinpoint if Ryan is a consumer of your organization and Ryan says, tell me exactly what data you have on me. with this, we can index through all the environments and give you a report that says this is exactly where Ryan's information is. And upon request, we can actually go ahead and delete all of Ryan's information. So again, where can we do this? We can obviously do this on premises. We can do this in cloud and AWS. And again, this is really where the solution comes from strength. It can work with all flavors of Hadoop, multiple different databases, S3 again, and then any kinds of file shares that you might have on premises. So real quick, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of this. Creating this privacy inventory requires you to basically scan your environment. So once the solution looks at, say, a column, it's able to identify, well, there's an email, there's an email, there's an email. It aggregates all the contents of this column, then checks for some metadata and makes a determination. So here you can see that it doesn't really matter what shape, size, structure of that column is. The data is scanned, and then there's a determination that's made. And then based on that determination, we can report this column has, maybe emails or IDs, or probably a column has multiple different sensitive elements. And then again, similarly, based on a policy, these elements can be pseudonymized. A similar use case for unstructured data, where what we can do is we can actually go through all the unstructured data and then classify what these different elements are. And then again, leverage contextual information and give these elements some semantic meaning. So again, come across a 9-digit number, could be routing numbers, social security numbers, employee IDs, or noise. And it takes some intelligence to really, really figure out what this 9-digit number represents. And so the solution actually leverages, again, machine learning and some other advanced heuristics, and is able to give you very, very granular information regarding what's where in your environment. And similarly, once you find that, you can remediate that by masking it one way, or if needed, you could also encrypt this. Real quick, the evolution of data privacy, and we're seeing this across the board. There were a lot of directives, good practices. Really, if somebody working at an organization was a good data steward with good enough motivation, they would try to put the right controls around the data. But now, today in 2018, we've moved to a scenario where all these directives and just these best practices have actually become real laws with a lot of dire consequences if the privacy is not properly handled. And we see this, in all finance, healthcare, e-com, retail, government, that enterprises are now taking this very, very seriously. And this is one of the reasons why, we have Trove here today. When Trove adopted the Amazon Web Services, they knew that, what AWS really preaches is this shared security model, where they say we have this really, really immensely strong infrastructure where, we'll guarantee that from an infrastructure point of view, you're absolutely secure. But when you're running applications and you're doing, your production or dev test workloads in AWS, the security of the data is actually the customer's responsibility. And this is really where DataGuys fits in, because it can provide that technology. And from a customer point of view, we want to highlight today Trove, who actually were an early adopter in this. And this is, and Tyrone's going to go into their business, which is actually very international. They have presence in Germany, Australia, UK, and it's tough because you're working with all these different privacy laws, but this is something that Tyrone analyzed, and he came up with a strategy which was actually far ahead of its time. So they bought into AWS because of its robustness, analytical value, economics, and all the good stuff. And then when they came across DataGuys, they saw this, how we fit into the shared security model. And Tyrone's going to talk about the rest. Before I hand this over to Tyrone, I really want to tell everyone that at Data Guys, we've come out with a Digi Secure on Demand. So you can follow this link. We'll be pasting this in the chat window. And this is a solution where, you're going to make a couple of clicks and you'll be able to spin up Data Guys pointed to your data. And for free, you're going to be able to run some checks on your very own data. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tyrone.
Thank you, Anhad. Hi, everyone. My name is Tyrone Mills, and I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Trove. So Trove is an insurance platform provider. We're perhaps best known for providing on-demand insurance for single items, as well as for passengers and autonomous vehicles. At the present time, our products and services are available in the US, the UK, and Australia. Now, before engaging Data Guys, we were dealing with privacy and data protection laws in Australia and the EU. We've since added the US and are in the process of launching in several other countries. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, data privacy and regulatory compliance are critical components of our business. Data Guys has allowed us to move away from developing and maintaining our own tool to a far more advanced solution that's reduced our cost, improved our compliance posture, and increased the efficiencies and internal customer satisfaction. So this diagram gives you a simplified idea of the sort of processes we had in place before Data Guys. So for data sources with no sensitive information, we were able to make read replicas available to our data scientists. For all other data sources, we had to apply our own in-house ETL that stripped the sensitive data. Now, that in-house ETL required rework every time there was a schema change or a change to the type of data that was being stored in a column. And our product offerings were rapidly evolving, so this happened quite frequently, which meant that this process was probably broken more often than it wasn't. And engineering resources were typically focused on getting new product releases or new features added to the product. So trying to get attention on internal tools wasn't always happening in an ideal time frame. And to add to that, within the tool, we took a really simple approach and just dropped any column that did or could contain sensitive data, which didn't make our analytics team very happy. Add to that the fact that the process was run every 24 hours, so the data was always a day out of date. And again, analytics wasn't a really happy customer. Now, this diagram shows you, after we've deployed Data Guys, how we were able to simplify our approach and provide the data scientists with a consistent access to data 24 hours a day without that delay. So they've got access to mask data when they want it, near real time, without two different sources, one in near real time, one delayed 24 hours. Those issues are now gone. So now with Data Guys, we're able to manage the masking of data easily without requiring engineering resources. We aren't sacrificing referential integrity by dropping columns. And we're also able to preserve the analytics value of data due to the masking options that Data Guys makes available to us. Being able to quickly and easily mask any data source in our environment has opened up an unexpected value for us. We're now able to provide fully sanitized data sets to our engineering, QA, and marketing groups, eliminating the need to rely on these scripted, small, stale, really non-representative data sets that we used to create manually. Our marketing department is now able to analyze the customer journey by digging into these sanitized data sets, which they use when they're conducting A/B tests or launching new promo campaigns. And All of this is in near real time. So continuing on the unexpected benefits theme, on the morning of May 25th, we had literally dozens of right to erasure requests. Originally, the expectation had been that these would kind of trickle in at a low rate and they could be actioned manually, but that wasn't the case. So we used data guys to anonymize the data of anyone invoking the right to erasure. This happens across all our data sets, and by taking this approach, we don't impact analytics by creating gaps in the data. We don't impact our fraud teams by removing potentially meaningful information from the data sets. And best of all, we don't have to have someone manually combing multiple data sets for all records related to a specific user. One of our biggest wins, in my opinion, is the fact that we're able to sanitize chat logs that we capture between our claims agents and our customers. Now, those chat logs, more often than not, contain sensitive data, but in no way in a predictable manner. It might be banking information, could be a home address, an IP address, phone number, any number of sensitive items in any combinations or none at all. Data Guys is able to treat that column as unstructured data. It scans it and finds any and all sensitive information and masks each type appropriately. So this was a huge win, as we were really afraid that even with Data Guys, we were going to have to drop this column before we made it available to our analytics and frauds team. And as it turns out, we haven't had to do that. We're able to maintain that. And, you know, to me, that's one of our biggest wins. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Ryan.
Thanks, Tyrone. I'm going to get into some Q&A. I see a few questions in there, but this is a good opportunity to ask any questions of any of the presenters. I do have a couple I'll get started with, though. While we're speaking, I've got this slide up here with a bunch of links, and we're also going to paste those links into the chat window. So if you want to click on them as opposed to having to write them down, that will help. All right, Anahad, the first question here is for you. So you discussed that Data Guys supports various databases, Hadoop vendors, and AWS S3. Paul would like to know if you also support Linux and Windows file systems and how that might work.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So on Windows file system, you know, we have these remote connectors. We used to call them agents. We call them data processors now. And the reason is they could sit on this Windows or Linux system, or they could sit remotely, with the only requirement being that the file system of the machine that you're trying to scan should be able to be mounted on the machine where you've installed our data processors.
Okay. Tyrone, this is a question for you. Michael wanted to know why you don't have a read copy after the Data Guys instance. I've got clarification here. Right? In the Trove example, you remove the read copy of non-sensitive data. I wanted to know why there's not a copy available for the sensitive side as well.
So why did we remove the read replica of non-sensitive data?
Correct.
Okay. So that diagram was meant to just provide a simplified overview. Certainly the non-sensitive data is still available. It's just everything is treated the same now, and it's all scanned by Data Guys. We don't have separate processes for sensitive versus non-sensitive, so everything comes across the same.
Okay, perfect. Anahad, I think this one's for you. It looks to work well for direct identifiers. What about masking indirect identifiers? Do you need to train the system to pick out indirectly identifying data?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways we can do that. First of all, when we work with the GRC teams or InfoSec teams, they have an idea about what indirect identifiers, or what we can call them as quasi identifiers, that need to be found and masked. So one of the banks that we work with, they said that credit card numbers actually by themselves, they're not sensitive, but credit card numbers with CVVs and zip codes together, now you find them and remediate them. So for the most part, we actually do rely on the legal or the InfoSec teams of our customers. But since we've been doing this for a really long time, we have certain insights into what these quasi identifiers could be. And then as far as the training aspect of it goes, once we figure out what they are, we can then train our machine learning modules with some labeled data, and then that could go in and find those indirect identifiers.
Makes sense. Tyrone, this question is for you. How are you dealing, or are you dealing at all with the privacy and of the data in the source systems?
So that information, we aren't masking our source systems at all. Unfortunately, our products don't support that, so we're relying on encryption for those systems.
I think is pretty much the way that most everyone does it. And like I said in the past, you have to collect data and you have to be able to use it. So that definitely makes it a little bit difficult. Anhad, Lewis asked a question. Can you explain how GDPR compliance is made easier through pseudonymized data?
Yeah, actually, pseudonymization is one of the requirements of GDPR, right? So I think, first and foremost, just understanding GDPR says, go find all your privacy data and, figure out why you're collecting what you're collecting, right? And this itself is a really, really important step. Now, the second step, and this is somewhere, that Tyrone's already talked about this, is let's say you have that data and you want to run analytics or depth test workloads on that data, right? Now, why should the real raw sensitive data be given to analysts or shared with third parties, or, put in some public domains where customers' privacy can be revealed? So the right way to do things is take that data and then massage it somehow. Maybe like one of the banks that we work with, what they do is they take every credit card number and they change the middle 6 digits of that credit card number. So the first 6 and the last 4 digits are retained. And that's good enough to do analytics on that data, but it ensures that the customer privacy is not revealed. So pseudonymization for running your business, right, it becomes an extremely important requirement so that you can get the most out of your data and you make sure that the consumer's privacy is not revealed.
And a follow-up question is, from Alberto is, what are the different options for anonymizing data?
Yeah, so today, out of the box, the Data Guy solution has more than 40 different ways in which you can change this data. But I'm not going to run through all of them, but just at a very high level, what we have the capability to do is change a data element completely or partially, right? So what that means is, let's say you have social security numbers, you can X out the first 5 digits and you retain the last 4. But also what that means is you take a name like Ryan, capital R, small Y-A-N, and you change it into Matt, a capital M, small A-T-T. So it's a 4-lettered name. It's a male name, and it's written in the same format that the raw data was.
I see another question on here about whether Data Guys is available on AWS Marketplace. And I believe I can answer that, as I believe that is absolutely true. One of the questions somebody asked is, were there other alternative solutions that you looked at with respect to privacy and governance?
This was nearly 3 years ago that we engaged with Data Guys, and at the time there was nothing that I found or was aware of that addressed our needs as fully as as data guys did. We needed something that wouldn't require us to ship our data anywhere, so it had to be able to be deployed in our infrastructure, which was in AWS. So, on-premise was totally out of the question for us. And, that and a number of other requirements, data guys checked all those boxes. So there was no other serious contenders.
Yeah, I think that's somewhat still the case. I think I see other people who are just starting to get into the space, but data guys has been at it for quite some time. Could you compare the solution to other things on the market? What makes data guys better than others in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think typically in this space of information security, there's a big bucket of solutions that are sort of pitched against each other. One of them is, your straight up encryption and tokenization solutions. Again, the big advantage that we have is our ability to find the privacy sensitive data. And that really is the big feather in our cap, the fact that we can plow through petabytes of data and give you a full inventory of exactly where all your GDPR, PII, PCI data might be. That's the real big thing that stands out. Again, DLP solutions is something that sometimes we're compared to, but again, they're more about packet scanning or data in motion scanning, and that's more at the network level. What we're giving you is data at rest analysis, and because we're looking at data at rest, we're able to use all these context-based heuristics and machine learning to be very, very accurate at classifying and finding sensitive data. Another thing that we get compared to is sometimes suite vendors, where you have a bunch of technologies that are packaged together. Again, you're not buying one solution, then you're basically buying a bunch of toolkits that someone says, hey, I can connect to Oracle, then they can write another driver that can say connect to a different database. So again, the big advantage here we have is it's just one solution that can automatically connect to all the different kinds of repositories that you might have. So being fully automated, right, and having this ability to do the detection before doing the remediation are really some of the unique differentiators that we have.
Alex asked a question. He says, I get how Digi Secure can pseudonymize data, but what about restoring it to a useful original data? Is that a possibility to do in data guys?
So if we are masking the data, that is a one-way transformation. And the reason is because it's fast and random. The overheads are almost none. If we have to go back, then we would have to do format preserving encryption, or we would have to do just irregular AES encryption. Now that is useful because, for especially like I mentioned earlier, for production use cases, you do need reversibility. But if you're trying to do analytics or dev tests or business intelligence kind of use cases, then there is actually no need for you to go back to the original data. You're just going to incur all these overheads for no good reason.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's also a level of risk that an organization is willing to deal with. So if you encrypt data, then that means that somebody with the keys can decrypt it, and it's possible that down the road that encryption becomes more accessible and more hackable. If you do a one-way program, then you reduce the risk more dramatically because it can't be undone. So it really comes down to maybe your level of users. If you don't ever need to, then don't do it. And I'll give you one example. Is even within AWS, we are really careful about anonymizing data, so we don't deal with anything related to PII. If a data scientist wants to work on information, that PII doesn't exist for them. The one piece of information that in theory could be used to re-identify is a customer number, and that customer number is also randomized, but can be decrypted for the right purpose. So I think those kinds of ways of thinking about it, what level of risk are you willing to handle, is really where you decide what policy you want data guys to apply to the data.
Plus, just to add to that, just one more point is your anonymization requirements could be, very, very broad. So you might want to anonymize the data in such a way that you're converting the age into a range, right? Or you might be massaging the data in such a way that, you need to create different versions of that data rather than create an encrypted copy that you just want to get back. So being able to massage that data in many different versions can allow different kinds of analytical use cases on it, which is why masking just ends up being a better option.
And I would challenge everybody on the call to think about their organizations or their customers' organizations if you're an SI. Really ask this question: do you need personal information to get the job done? I found that when I speak to customers about this, there's various times when you need it, and usually it's at that source system level. I need it to, in Trove's case, provide an insurance policy. I need to be able to send a bill and things like that. But outside of that, do you really need it? Do you need an analyst to be able to analyze all of the data? Do they need to know the exact address where I live, or can they do it by zip or by state? And what pieces of actual information do you need? Do you need my first name and my last name, or do you just need my first name? So when you start digging into those questions, that will, I think, help to develop the policy. And you may find there's 2 or 3 different policies, and it might be that you break it up into some groups where there might be one group that doesn't need anything and you don't want them to have anything, in which case you've just reduced the risk of that group of people accidentally or by being a rogue agent walking away with data that they shouldn't. I think we've gotten to the end of some of the questions. I'll wait about 30 more seconds to see if any others come in, but I think that was a really great discussion. All right. Well, I think this is a good time to close up. So I request everybody to when they receive the satisfaction survey after the webinar, to fill it out. It helps us to make these more valuable. I want to thank the presenters for coming and speaking. So Dr. Anand Singh, as well as Terma Mills. We appreciate all you from your attendees side coming and taking time out of your day to spend time with us, and look forward to talking to you guys soon. Take care.